Alright, so we're using a 17mm socket to get these lug bolts off, and I do have lug bolts, not lug studs. You're going to want to do this while the car's still on the ground, so you can, actually break the bolts, otherwise the wheel will just turn. Although this is a rear wheel, so you can use the parking brake if the car is already up in the air. But I'm using a cheater bar to get a little bit more leverage so I can get these all off. So we go ahead and jack up the car now. Alright, now that the car's up, just go ahead and finish taking off all these bolts. You're going to want to loosen them initially in a alternating pattern, but once they're all loose, you can kind of just take them off as they are because the tension's released. You just don't want to warp the wheel when you first take off the bolts. Wheels are cheaper than bodywork, so it's okay to put that wheel under the car. First thing you want to do is remove this little metal clip. After you remove that, you're going to go towards the back of the rotor, or rather the inside of the rotor. You got this little rubber boot there that covers the bolt that goes into the pin that holds the caliper, the two parts of the caliper together. That is going to be a T50 Torx bit inside there. On the front, it was a 10mm bolt, so it's kind of interesting. It was a different. It's interesting that it was a different fastener for it. I did not realize that leaf was there. I was kind of holding the camera and trying to squeeze my head in there too. You can see there's that larger bolt on the left side there. That's going to be a 17mm. There's also one beneath it. Those are the two mounting bolts for the actual like caliper mounting hardware that holds the whole assembly together, or the whole assembly to the wheel hub. So to get that little metal clip off, it helps to use either pliers or channel lock pliers, something like that, and pull up from the bottom side that's hooked in, because you're gonna pull in on the tension and get those little hooks out. So here I was talking about how it's good to make sure you don't damage this thing too much and try to hold on to it, don't lose it. In reality, my kit actually had a replacement one, but I didn't see it. Make sure you check all of your equipment before you start the job. Now here, unfortunately, I got in front of the camera, but I wanted to show that you can use a box end wrench over the ratchet handle to get a little bit more leverage at kind of an angle, so it's great for really small areas. Wouldn't recommend doing this for super tight bolts because you don't want to damage your wrench. You also don't want to damage your ratchet. I was just loosening those to get a little bit of room so I could squeeze my screwdriver in between the uh, caliper piston and the brake pad, or and then press against the brake rotor to get a little bit of room. I wouldn't necessarily recommend pressing against the brake rotor if you're going to be keeping them and refinishing them. But in this case, I'm just replacing all my rotors, so it's perfectly okay. I'm not worried about damaging them or the brake pads. So once you get a little bit of room with the screwdriver, you can get a pry bar in there and then get a little bit more gap. You have to push the piston back for the space that the new brake pads are going to take up. New brake pads are obviously going to be thicker than the old brake pads. So after you move the caliper, you can go ahead and remove the brake pads right there and just make sure to hang the caliper up somewhere where it's not dangling by the brake line. You don't want to damage brake line. I noticed mine were particularly dry and cracked, so I'll perhaps get in there eventually and replace that. I just went ahead and put some WD-40 inside the rotor in case it was stuck, because I was going to be taking some other stuff off, might as well let that soak. As we look back here at the caliper, you can see it's pretty dirty and rusted as well. There are the two T50 Torx bolts that held it onto the pins, or excuse me, held the pins in place. You can see over here we have the two bolts that mount the uh, mounting bracket, the caliper mounting bracket, to the wheel hub. Those are both going to be 17mm bolts. Just like the lug nuts, going to use the cheater bar to get a little bit more torque and break those off. As I removed the bolts, I noticed that they were coated in a little bit of oil. It was really old smelling oil. I did notice somewhere in the manual while I was looking for information on how to remove the brakes that it does recommend occasionally putting oil on the bolts to prevent seizing. Um, Living in Colorado, I'm not too concerned about rust or anything like that, so I didn't really re-oil them when I put them back in, but I did wipe them clean from any contaminants or particles that could have gotten on the threads. So we got the caliper mounting bracket off. Let's take a closer look at it. So this is also obviously quite rusty. Um, you can see it has those runner tracks kind of in the either side. That's where the brake pads are going to be, or the brake pad guides are going to be running up against. So all that rust and corrosion is going to be causing a lot of issues for smooth braking. So I'm just going to clean that off with a wire brush. Now I had my parking brake on this whole time because the bolt that's supposed to hold the rotor in place is snapped on all four of my wheels, so it's really more of a guide pin at this point. So the parking brake, helped keep everything in place while I was working on it. I just had to, real quick, release the brake and then remove the rotor. Here we can take a look at the rotor. It doesn't look too terrible. It's definitely rusty. It's got a very shiny finish on it, but I wouldn't say exactly like a mirror finish. You can see all the particulate from the drum brake on the inside there. Again, it's really not too terribly rusty. I would have expected it to be worse. Definitely good to be replaced though. Before I put the new rotor on, I just want to wipe out all the WD-40 I got on there, as well as give it a little bit of a dusting. I'm not cleaning it too intense or too thoroughly, just a little bit of a wipe down. Real quick, while everything's taken off, we can take a look at the drum brake. I don't need to adjust anything, but if I did need to adjust my parking brake, you can see a little tooth there. I could turn that, a certain number of notches, and then just make sure I match that number of notches on the other side. Something I noticed in the BMW manual is it said to, before you adjust your parking brake, drive about 1,200 feet, 12 or 1,300 feet with the parking brake fully engaged. So here's the mounting bracket all wire brushed off. Obviously still pretty rusty, still pretty dirty, but it's definitely going to be a lot smoother, running a lot better than it was before. Maybe when we go back to school, if we have access to a sandblast or something, I'll rebuild these calipers because they could definitely use it. So now is a good time to talk about drilled and slotted rotors. Something I learned recently is that the slots and the drilled holes doesn't matter which direction they face, either with or against the direction of rotation, but the vanes inside the rotor, the direction they face, that is important. In this case, since they're just completely straight, flat vanes, I can face these rotors either way, so it's really just a cosmetic preference at that point. All the reinstallation is pretty simple. Torque up the caliper mounting bracket bolts to, it was about 60 foot-pounds of torque. It was between 50 and 60 foot-pounds of torque. Then I just went ahead and cleaned up the caliper with a stiff plastic brush. I didn't want to use a wire brush because I didn't want to damage the rubber boot on the piston. You can go ahead and put the brake pads in. The caliper should just slide over your rotor, no problem. You can now tighten the bolts that go into the caliper pins. Make sure you remember to put this little metal tensioning tab on here. Retighten the wheels to about 70 foot-pounds of torque, and you are good to go. One more thing to mention, this is the other side on the rear. There is a brake pad wear indicator. Uh, Pretty simple. It literally just plugs into a little connector behind the rotor, and then that other end snaps into the brake pad there. I assume that little piece of plastic there wears down and either breaks or makes an electrical contact, and it illuminates the dashboard.